When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the beast say, "Come and see." I looked, and beheld a pale horse, and he who sat upon it was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given to them over a fourth part of the world, to kill with war and famine, and with pestilence, and with the beasts of the earth.
Hello hunters, and welcome back to Super Fan Natural. There are few symbols more evocative of the end of the world than the four horsemen of the apocalypse. This killer quartet are well-known heralds of the end times, and they've long since made their way into pop culture. Actually, I first learned about them from X-Men, so just in case any of you ever get the idea that I'm too cultured, just keep that in mind. In Supernatural, the Horsemen aren't just omens or symbols, they're actual sentient creatures with incredible powers. Now, throughout the show, we got all sorts of lore explaining the origins of angels and demons and even God Almighty himself. But weirdly, we never got any info about where these apocalyptic hombres came from, or even really what they are. In this video, I'll go over the little that we do know about them, and try to explain my thoughts on their possible origins and nature. Let's start with what we actually do know about the Horsemen. We don't know exactly what they are, but they seem to be a unique race of cosmic beings that sits somewhere in the ballpark of the Archangels and the God Twins. They're not angels or demons. Instead, they seem to be manifestations of concepts like hunger and disease, embodied as sentient creatures. When we actually see the Horsemen, they appear human. However, it's clear that this isn't their true form, but rather a visage that they take in order to blend in on Earth. We never get to see what they actually look like, but considering that they're cosmic entities, their real form is probably something incomprehensible to the human mind. It's also possible that they appear as something intangible or immaterial, kind of like how Death in the Final Destination movies manifests as spooky wind. We know that at least War has the ability to choose his human appearance, since during his time on Earth, he took the form of an already existing guy. One of the Horsemen's most notable features is their rings. Each member of the apocalyptic posse wears a magical ring, and while we never get a detailed breakdown or history of this mysterious jewelry, we do know a few deets. Firstly, the rings appear to be tied to the Horsemen's powers. We saw two of them twist their rings in order to make spooky stuff happen, and later we learned that it's possible for a mortal to gain the powers of death by putting on his ring. The rings also seem to play a role in the ability for some of the Horsemen to manifest a physical body. When War and Pestilence had their rings cut off, they each vanished into thin air shortly afterwards. The demon Brady confirmed that this didn't kill them, but it did leave them in a weakened state. This weakness doesn't seem to affect Death, or at least not as much, since he was able to stick around after giving his ring away, and after about a year without it, he didn't show any signs of deterioration. Although, he was the only one to willingly give his ring away, rather than have it forcibly taken, so maybe that factors into things. Finally, if all four rings are gathered together, they can be megazorded to create a fidget spinner-esque key, which can open portals into Lucifer's cage, a magical prison stashed in the deepest depths of hell. Why exactly do the rings do this? Don't know. The Horsemen have a kind of weird relationship with the devil. Shortly after Lucifer was freed in Season 5, War, Famine, and Pestilence appeared on Earth and began actively helping the evil Archangel carry out his apocalyptic human extinction plan. We didn't really know where they were before this, nor if Lucifer personally did something to bring them to the field, but they seemed pretty willing to work with him. Death was the outlier. Not only did Lucifer have to free him from some sort of prison, once he was topside, Death didn't really want to participate in the apocalypse, so Lucy had to bind him with special magic. It's also worth noting that while we don't get much information about the life and history of the other three Horsemen, Death claimed to be as old, if not older, than God, and he referred to Lucifer as a bratty child. Just keep that in mind for later when we theorize about where these dudes might have come from. Besides the rings, each Horseman has a, horse that they can ride across the land and spread their apocalyptic chaos. At one point, these rides were probably real horses. However, in the modern day, they've upgraded their horsepower into color-coded cars. Oh yeah, each Horseman is associated with a specific color, represented by their ride and ring. War is red, Famine is black, Pestilence is green, and Death is white. Those last two are a bit of a departure from biblical lore. In the Book of Revelation, the white horse is associated with conquest, and its rider is sometimes interpreted to be Jesus or the Antichrist. The last horse is referred to as pale, which is most commonly translated to be a sickly green or skeletal, and its rider is explicitly named as Death, though the passage also states that Death would bring plagues. It's a little funny that they get cars to drive around, considering that they can actually just teleport, but I think that the vehicles are meant to represent how they actively create paths of destruction during the apocalypse. Also, I'm not really a car guy and had to look up which models each horseman drove, so if any of that is wrong, then blame the internet. The exact relationship between the horsemen is a bit nebulous. War and Pestilence refer to themselves as brothers, and in Pestilence's case, he seemed to have some genuine affection for his bros. Famine and Death never mention the other guys, and things are further complicated by the fact that at least Death can, and was, killed and replaced. When the original Death was jabbed with his own scythe, he crumpled away to dust. Then a few years later, the Reaper Billy took his place after she was killed by Cass. She didn't turn into the old Death, she retained her personality and memories, but she did gain her own version of Death's ring and scythe and inherited seemingly all of his powers and responsibilities. This event made it seem like Death was more of a position rather than a specific person, further muddling our understanding of how exactly the Horsemen work and what they are. We don't see any of the others get replaced like this, and if I'm being honest, I don't know who or what would replace them. Death was replaced by Reapers, personal minions dedicated to him and his mission. The other Horsemen didn't really have their own races of underlings. I mean, Famine and Pestilence were aided by demons on loan from Lucifer, so maybe they could inherit the title? Ultimately, it doesn't seem like Horsemen have to be replaced, since during the roughly year-and-a-half period between OG Death's death and Billy's promotion, people still died like normal. This certainly makes it seem like the Horsemen embody certain concepts or forces, but they're not necessarily the ultimate source of their respective namesakes, if that makes sense. Now that we know about the Horsemen as a group, let's talk about each individual brother. The first one we ever met was War. Now, when you picture the embodiment of War, you probably envision a powerful warrior, a knight clad in bloody armor and wielding a great fiery sword. Well, that's not quite the show's approach. Actually, Supernatural's version of War doesn't really do any direct fighting. Instead, he infiltrates peaceful communities and uses a combination of illusions and manipulation to turn neighbors against each other and whip them up into a violent, bloodthirsty frenzy. I really need to stress just how minimal War's touch is. When we see him in the show, he's divided a town by making its residents see each other as black-eyed demons. That's it. He doesn't control what they say or hear, he just makes them see each other with black eyes. He might also cloud his victims' minds to a certain degree, considering the fact that several seasoned hunters didn't really question why demons could suddenly be put down with regular bullets, but we know that he doesn't exert total control over their thoughts. It is possible to talk down those under his influence, and if they come to their senses, they'll be able to see through War's illusions. Besides his genjutsu skills, War can read minds, shapeshift, and when he first manifests physically, he appears as a comet. War's ring is the simplest of the set. It's just a plain gold band without any stones or decoration, and when combined with the others, it serves as the center to the key, with the other rings attaching to it by their stones. In the modern day, War's horse takes the form of a red Mustang, like a Ford Mustang, not an actual horse. After War, we met Famine, who I personally find to be one of the creepiest horsemen and one of the most unsettling characters in the entire show. When we met him, Famine appeared as a sickly old man dependent on a wheelchair, oxygen tank, and demons to function. But don't let his frail form fool you into thinking he's not dangerous. All this dude has to do is get close to someone, and they'll suddenly be overcome by an unimaginable hunger that ultimately drives them to self-destructive consumption. Like, one of his victims was so hungry for Twinkies, he used a toilet brush to physically jam them down his throat after he couldn't swallow anymore. What's interesting about Famine's power is that it doesn't just affect a person's appetite for food. According to the Horseman himself, physical hunger comes from the body, but humans are also driven by spiritual hunger, which comes from the soul and causes them to crave less tangible things like love or power. When Famine rolls into town, his poisonous influence will drive anyone and everyone, including angels, to become psychotically ravenous for the thing that they crave most, be it food, affection, sex, or whatever they don't have enough of. Side note, we see one of his victims mad-grabbing handfuls of money, and I just kind of wonder how exactly that ended up killing her. Famine himself is also plagued by an endless hunger, with the only thing that can satisfy him being human souls, including ones that have been converted into demons. His ring is silver with a circular black stone, and his horse appears to be a Cadillac Escalade. Our next apocalypse jockey is Pestilence, the nastiest brother, and the only one besides Death to appear in more than one episode. Out of all the Horsemen, Pestilence is probably the most straightforward shtick-wise. He creates disease and spreads them. That's it. No mind games like War or grand cosmic powers like Death. He's just a mad scientist who likes making people sick in new and inventive ways. With just a wave of his hand, he can materialize horrific infections within someone, and with a little bit of time, he can brew up new, supernaturally powerful bugs, with his magnum opus being the zombifying rage virus, Croatoan. So his powers are pretty simple, but things get a little more interesting when we examine his motivations. Of all the Horsemen, Pestilence seems to have the most overt contempt for humanity. He sees disease as a beautiful, orderly process carried out by simple and efficient organisms, and that it's weak humans who give disease a reputation for being messy and icky. He's also the only Horseman to express care for his brothers, as seen when he sought revenge after the Winchesters neutralized war and famine. Beyond that, there's not much else to say about this dude. His ring is silver with a circular green stone, and his horse is a sickly green hornet with a custom license plate that reads Sick and Tired. Last up, we have Death. There's a lot to say about Big D, so much so that I made an entire video dedicated to him, which you should definitely check out. To very briefly summarize, Death is not only the strongest Horseman, he's one of the most powerful beings in the show. He has near complete control over life and death, can bend space and time at will, has intimate knowledge of some of creation's most closely guarded secrets, and most impressively, he claimed that one day he would reap God himself. His disposition is also a bit different from his bros. While the other Horsemen gleefully followed Lucifer and spread destruction across America, Death never really wanted to intervene in mortal affairs. His only real concern was maintaining the natural order, a vague set of rules or circumstances that keep reality from imploding. One of the most interesting details about the original Death was his claim of having been as old, if not older than God, something that was a bit hard to square with information we got later. Death's ring was silver with a white stone that was square for the original version and circular for Billy and Betty, and the original Death drove a white Cadillac Coupe de Ville with a custom license plate that read "Bye-bye." We never get to see if his replacements get their own models. I like to think they do, but, who knows. So that's who the Horsemen are, but we still haven't answered the far more elusive questions of what they are and where they came from. As I've said, the best way to describe the boys is as embodiments of concepts, properties of reality manifested as sentient beings. Death represents fragility, impermanence, and fundamental weakness that ultimately brings things to an end. Pestilence is uncontrolled growth, the ability for something to grow, change, and multiply until it overwhelms its environment. Famine is deficiency, unfulfillment, and a void that drives its subject to consume until they implode. And war? Well, war is war. It's conflict, separate things just not being able to harmonize with each other. At one point in time, I believe that the forces which the Horsemen represent were the result of flaws in creation. Like, God created biological life forms that can reproduce on their own, are driven by hunger, and who will ultimately die. This could still work as an explanation, but I actually think it goes deeper than that. I personally believe that the Horse forces have been present within reality since God and the darkness first split apart and became independent beings. Death did say that he was as old as God, yet later Amara said that she didn't know who Death is, and that she and her brother were alone in the beginning, so how would that work? Well, I don't think that he was floating around as a living, breathing Julian Richings. No, I think Death was present as an immaterial component of existence. I mean, the twins are the fundamental pillars of reality. They both have to be or not be at the same time, or else the natural order becomes fully wonked, and the whole of existence will just implode. As such, you'd think that they would be indestructible, but no, they're fully capable of wiping each other out. As the embodiment of destruction, Amara can just outright murk her brother, something that I don't think God can do. However, he is able to defeat her by creating other beings to fight alongside him, and with enough added firepower, he can tip the balance and overwhelm his sister, kind of like a pestilent infection overwhelming an immune system. Now, the pair are supposed to balance each other, to live together in harmony, but that's not how things went down. God wasn't happy with the status quo. He yearned, hungered, to expand creation beyond his sister's comfort level, and this sparked a war between them. So, as you can see, the Horsemen's influence didn't start with humanity. Conflict, hunger, proliferation, and impermanence have been a part of existence since the beginning. They didn't take the same form as the God Twins, but whether you see them as forces or concepts or something else, they were there. I believe that since the first three played such a big role in sealing the darkness and shifting the paradigm of reality, they ended up becoming integral parts of creation. God's actions fundamentally disrupted the natural order, and so the world he made was stained with their disruptions, their influences woven into the fabric of reality. I know it's kind of a heady concept, But think of it like gravity. In the same way that gravity is a fundamental property of space, the underlying properties that the Horsemen represent are fundamental elements of creation due to how God brought the universe into being. Okay, but then where exactly does the man part of Horsemen come from? How do we go from fundamental forces to walking, talking dudes? Well, going back to real physics, when enough gravity is concentrated into one place, you end up with a black hole, a physical manifestation of the force in its most extreme form. Now, imagine if you could somehow leash a black hole and transfer it into a sentient creature. You'd essentially have gravity incarnate, right? Kinda, sorta. Well, that's essentially what I think is going on with the Horsemen. They're the most intense expressions of the fundamental forces concentrated and magically shaped into sentient beings. In my video talking specifically about death, I theorized that the Horsemen's rings are what allow them to take physical form. And I stand by that. After all, we hear that several months after having their rings cut off, War and Famine have been reduced to shriveled husks, suggesting that the rings are what concentrate their power and hold their bodies together. Now, when it comes to who made the rings and why, well, that's harder to figure out. I have plenty of ideas, but without many facts to back them up, I feel like gushing too much would cross over the line of evidence-based speculation and veer right into fanfic territory, so I'll just give you a very brief summary of my headcanon. Personally, I believe that God made the rings for death, famine, and pestilence in order to try and control or maybe just understand these forces that plagued his creations. Alternatively, he could have done it to keep their influence out of the Garden of Eden so that it would be a perfect paradise. Whatever the case, I believe that Chuck made the first three, but that it was Lucifer who forged War's ring as part of his first biblical temper tantrum. This is why War is the weakest of his brothers, why his ring is different, and why it serves as the centerpiece for the cage key configuration. Part of my reasoning here is that War is the most optional of the horse forces. Like famine, pestilence, and death can all be avoided to an extent, but they're also brought on by things outside of human control. And when it comes to their horsemen, you can't really fend off their influence by sheer willpower. By contrast, War is something that at least one side of the conflict has to choose to initiate, and it's the only one whose horseman power is entirely illusion-based. As such, it's the only one that humans can overcome by just stopping and listening to their perceived enemy. I believe that Lucifer forged the War Ring and gave its horseman form in order to prove to his dad that the kids were too weak and easy to break, although I'll fully admit that I might be overthinking all of this. Before we fully wrap up, I want to talk about Death for a sec, because I think he might be just a bit different from his bros. After all, not only does he seem leaps and bounds more powerful than his brothers, he also acts completely different from them. The other three were all too eager to spread their chaos as far and wide as they could, afflicting as many people as possible and sowing wanton destruction. By contrast, Death really doesn't want to do that. He's all about the natural order, and while he doesn't really care if a bunch of people die, he's not going to cause it himself unless doing so would prevent a more dangerous imbalance. Another thing that's sort of unique to Death is that his namesake is kind of what the other three lead to, right? Like War, Pestilence, and Famine all lead to death, but death doesn't necessarily lead to the others, at least not in the same way. I mean, it can, but there's a reason why death is the final horseman. So why is he so important? Well, like the others, I do believe that death is a primordial thing that rode into creation due to God's actions against Amara. However, I believe that he's actually a force of balance meant to keep his brothers, as well as God himself, in check. Essentially, War, Famine, and Pestilence represent different ways that God and his creations upset the natural order, and death is the counterbalance that keeps any of them from getting out of control and bricking the entire world. He basically acts as a replacement for Amara, a new form of controlled destruction that helps keep creation from getting too gummed up with chaos. Of all the nonsense I've put forth in this video, this is the point that I'm the most confident about. It just makes sense, right? At least a little bit? Well, that, along with everything else in this video, makes sense to me, and hopefully, I did an okay job of explaining my thinking process to you guys. So, maybe some of you start to agree with me. But what do you guys think? Did any of that make sense? Let me know in the comments. Guys, it's been a pretty great year for the channel, and it's all thanks to you. Well, I mean, I made the videos, but that wouldn't really matter if no one watched them, so thank you so much for the views and support. This will be the last video of 2024, but don't worry, I'll have more content coming in 2025. Till then, have a happy holidays, and just carry on.